As I mentioned, this is part of a town hall series that the SBRC, Hamilton, and CDH have undertaken. We did one at the end of June on affordable housing, and we were actually looking to do something on income security. And of course, then this thing called an election all of a sudden popped up, and we thought maybe this is where we would focus some attention. Of course, income security will be covered, as we know that's a pretty critical issue at our federal level. And so we will have time towards the end for people to engage in any questions, but we do have presentations from our guest presenters today, and then we will provide that time. You can put at that in the last sort of 25 minutes or so, we'll be looking to engage you with any questions that you might have of our panelists. And you can just put those in the chat or raise your hand. I think we might then unmute you allow you to speak your question if that works, but you can also, during the presentations, you can also put those questions in the chat and we can feed them along as we see fit. So at this time, I'm going to ask Judith to do land acknowledgement.
As we begin this important time together, it's really so essential more and more to ground ourselves in the knowledge that no matter where we're joining tonight, we are guests on this land. Most of us certainly are guests on this land. We are settlers, and we've not been good guests. And where I'm joining you from today is the city colonized as Hamilton, situated upon the ancestral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy land is determined by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It's also an area with long-standing relationships with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Six Nations of the Grand River. Wherever you are today, please feel free to put that in the chat room and let us know the territory from which you join us today. It's also important to remember Two-Spirit people who were an important and elevated part of Indigenous communities, and we hold up our hands to their amazing resistance, resilience, and strength in the face of ongoing dispossession and colonial violence. Acknowledging these lands today is just taking one step in demonstrating our commitment to dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And may we bring that same level of commitment to our conversation tonight. So Ted was going on there, getting into the agenda, which we did want to briefly cover, Ted? I'm going to bring you up into the spotlight here. And, you know, how's the conversation in Halton about the election? People are excited or just looking for this kind of information that we're presenting tonight. What's it feel like over there?
That definitely people are looking for good information and wanting to engage around some of these critical issues. I think I'm excited to hear from our various speakers tonight. I think they're hitting on those really critical ones. You know, one that I know that, and I'll be introducing Judith later on around childcare. I know that's a really critical one. As I've been doing some preparation for calculating an update on our living wage, childcare, of course, is one of those elements that is a pretty significant component and really weighs on people. And any positive change that we can have in how childcare is rolled out in our communities, I think is something that people are very interested in.
Right. And then I keep hearing, of course, climate crisis. I mean, we all do. That's like the leading story in so many ways, whether it's just the weather report. People are starting to recognize those connections, and hopefully they'll recognize those connections come Monday. And Linda's going to be giving us amazing information there to help inform that. And then we have Alex doing the whole piece on housing. We'll be so happy to, that we have a follow-up from our first session, which was about affordable housing. And now this is VoteHousing.ca, a campaign that will extend even beyond this election for sure. These issues will carry on. So it's good to hear about those. And then right off the top, and where we're starting tonight, is with Natalie Appleyard. And Natalie is the socioeconomic policy analyst for the Citizens for Public Justice. And that's an Ottawa-based it's a national group. She's coming to us tonight. She'll tell you from the unceded territory there. But she has been in Hamilton before, physically, many times, presenting the amazing information that CPJ puts out around poverty in this nation. October 18th every year, we have the Chew on This campaign that comes out of Citizens for Public Justice. So while CPJ and Natalie may be new to some of you tonight, she's not new, certainly to these issues, nor to this area of Hamilton Halton for sure. And I'm so glad to welcome her tonight. And she's CPJ has put out this election bulletin. She's going to be drawing on that and filling in the gaps on all kinds of other essential issues as we get ready to vote on Monday. So you think we're ready to? Oh, Ted mentioned the chat. I just want to say again, he was giving you a lot of latitude for question period at the end. I think we'll have about 15 minutes. We would love if people want to just engage in a dialogue, that'll be fine. But we definitely have some good questions and time lined up for the speakers to be engaged together. So that's how we're going to play out tonight. And that should be everything that you need to know. So I'm going to unspotlight the two of us and spotlight Natalie Appleyard. How are you doing tonight, Natalie?
I'm well, thanks. I'm happy to be here. I'm always excited to connect with folks in Hamilton, Halton. I'm always really so impressed with the amount of advocacy that's going on in there and the amount of engagement. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here and grateful for this opportunity to be with you, joining from the unceded and unsurrendered traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people in what's colonially known as Ottawa. And so I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit tonight some framing and some questions that we want voters to be considering as they think about casting their ballots on the 20th. And so you can find our full election bulletin online. So I'll be drawing from that bulletin tonight just to kind of frame our conversation. I know we're going to have some really great input and questions for Alex on housing and Judith on childcare and Linda on climate. So what I'm hoping to bring tonight is a bit of an overall framing about what do we mean even by a just Canada, and what should be factoring into our voting decisions if that's something that we want to pursue. So first off the bat, I think we can all agree, and this is a common phrase that we've been hearing throughout this pandemic, is that we need better than normal. We can't settle for a return to business as usual. It just meant death for too many people. Before the pandemic even, we had estimates that depending on which measure of poverty we're using in Canada, both of which are likely underestimates, the low income measure estimated that there were 5.9 million people living in poverty in Canada. Food insecurity was making it hard for 1 in 8 families to put food on the table. The latest estimate that I've seen for core housing need nationally was 11.6% of families or households that either had inadequate or unsuitable or unaffordable housing. And I'm sure that some of our other panelists will speak to some of these issues in greater detail. But the fact is that we need fundamental systemic reform, and elections are a great opportunity to really push that and test the waters and see where the different parties are at. And so we want to be thinking about, what is it that we want instead of what we have now? And obviously to do that, we need to kind of understand this current moment. So when we are considering our voting decisions, for example, are we satisfied with the party platforms? Are we satisfied with how our economic system has been? Well, I think most of us would say no, and we may all have different ideas depending on your political alignment as to what ought to be done to address those problems and solve those problems. And most I think all the parties will have something in their platform about what they would do to make life more affordable for folks, or to address the environment. Maybe not all of them addressing climate change per se, but we want to kind of tease that apart a little bit and think about what is it that we as a society really want to work towards. And for us at Citizens for Public Justice, that's really grounded in the inherent rights and dignity of all people, and seeking a society that is just and sustainable, and that supports the flourishing of all creation, so all people and all our relations, to borrow a phrase from Indigenous leaders. And so we want to think about, you know, where do we want to go and who is the best party to get us there? So we need to ask ourselves, will Canada's next federal government take the actions that are required to emerge from this moment a more resilient, more just, and more sustainable country? For example, the pandemic didn't show us anything we didn't know was already there. The murder of George Floyd in the United States did not show us anything that we didn't know was already there in terms of racism, but it has certainly exacerbated these things. Same with the lobster fishers, the Mi'kmaq lobster fishers in the Atlantic provinces. So throughout this crazy past year or two, all these fault lines that we knew were in our systems have just been, you know, widened and brought to the surface more, so that I don't think any of us would really say that, yeah, things were fine, we're good with the way things are. And we can certainly recognize that our status quo was not working for everyone in the same way. So we'll be talking about quite a range of issues tonight, but what I hope to bring up are some of the common undercurrents, some of the same systemic failings and the systemic reform that is required to address all these issues together, and then ask ourselves again, which party do we think is the best chance to get us to move us in the direction we want to go? And also, what are we going to do as members of civil society to hold our governments accountable to build this future, both at the polls, but also beyond? So the questions that, in terms of what we want for creating a better Canada, Ecos Research Associates shared that, you know, most Canadians say that they expect our country to go through a broad societal transformation, and suggest that Canada is on the cusp of transformative change. And so again, here's where we want to ask and dig into the platforms and the policies, and ask good questions to kind of cut through some of the spin and find out what's sort of the window dressing and what's dealing with things on more of a surface level, and what's going to actually tackle these underlying issues of inequity and systemic oppression in this country. So at Citizens for Public Justice, we envision a world in which individuals, communities, societal institutions, and governments all contribute to and benefit from the common good. And this common good, though it's good for all of us, requires that we honor the inherent rights and dignity of all people in all our relations, but we also recognize the different ways in which different groups of people in different communities are affected. And so we know, for example, in terms of the system that we have now, is that poverty, the effects of climate change, when we think about immigration laws, the people that are most impacted by these policy decisions are the least likely to have much say in creating them. They're most likely to be excluded from policy decision-making processes. They're most likely, the same people that are most likely to be impacted by climate change, for example, are the most likely to be impacted by poverty. So again, we're talking about people who are Indigenous, people who are Black, people who are disabled, people who are single, people who are Two-Spirit, LGBTQ. And so we know, again, that these same groups of people are disproportionately affected. So what are we going to do to address why that is? And so we need to think about how are we going to track our progress using disaggregated data? How are we going to set targets and timelines? How are we going to better ensure that there's input and representation and accountability from these groups in making decisions about their own futures and their own lives? So again, we want to think not only about the policies and the promises that are being made, but the capacity and the way in which policy decisions are going to be made. How are these systems going to be designed and implemented? Who's going to keep them accountable to the targets to make sure that we are actually closing the gaps that we know are there in terms of the socioeconomic and health outcomes of marginalized groups and straight, white, able-bodied folks. So the kinds of questions that we want voters to consider in general, again, are what kind of citizenry and civic engagement do we require to achieve this vision? Maybe Deirdre, yeah, thanks. What forms of governance and accountability are needed? And so again, that gets not just the policies, but the processes. And what do we need our federal government to be and to do to get us there? So those are kind of like the big questions. And then in terms of kind of what is this vision for a better Canada, and I'm using Canada, even recognizing that this is a colonial term because we're speaking in the context of the federal government to elect the government of Canada, but recognizing again that this is a colonial term. And so, you know, sometimes I find even talking about a just Canada seems a little bit inherently contradictory as a colonial state. But in terms of the lands in which we live and share and our society, that's what I'll be referring to throughout using the term Canada. And so I think part of the problem is that it's easy for us to settle into this idea that the way things are is how they inevitably will be or how they must be. And certainly the system is designed to give us the impression that it's how they should be. But again, I think throughout this pandemic, we've been calling out that lie, and so many people have seen that is a lie, that this is not how things ought to be, and it's not how things need to be. And sometimes we don't even need to imagine anything brand new in terms of a policy solution. We might just need to return to the way things went before this colonial state took over. So we can look forward with new and creative ideas, but we can also look back into the history of the peoples and the lands that pre-exist this colonial state. So again, in terms of this vision for what we could have and how things could be, some of the guiding themes that you'll find in our election bulletin and that we speak to are a society in which we value the inherent rights of all people, and including the rights of Indigenous peoples in particular, and treaty rights, for example. A society in which we have equity in terms of the distribution of wealth and resources, in terms of opportunities, in terms of the health and socioeconomic outcomes that people enjoy. And then with that, we also have social inclusion. So we recognize that even with programs that are and policies that are intended to help people who are in a tight spot, for example, or sort of this narrative that folks have fallen on hard times, unless we actually address these underlying systemic barriers, we won't actually deal with the problem of social exclusion that accompanies so many of these issues like poverty and climate justice and racism and xenophobia in Canada. So this requires partnership of both governments and civil society in terms of kind of both how we do our homework and change our own attitudes and learning and work with one another, but also in terms of the laws and institutions and policies that govern our country. And so some suggested questions that we have that you could ask your candidates, or that you could kind of have in mind as you're looking through various party policy platforms, is how and when do you plan to develop and implement the action plan required by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So this was an act that was recently passed in the Government of Canada, and it requires that we honor our international human rights commitments to Indigenous people specifically, and there are all kinds of specific requirements, for example, the free and prior informed consent, but also when will you fulfill the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls? Will you honor the orders of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal in terms of compensating First Nations kids and their families that were affected by residential schools, or who haven't had health needs met because of the violation of Jordan's Principle, for example? So again, some of these calls to action are, it's been a few years now. So again, we need to demand more urgent action to actually get these things done. And I think what we're finding in this particular political moment is that the kind of platitudes that we sometimes hear are not going to cut it for people. And so while there have been some important first steps taken on a number of issues, whether you're looking at the introduction of the poverty reduction strategy or the passing of this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, whether you're looking at housing legislation, the commitment to lower greenhouse gas emissions, to develop a national childcare program. Again, we want to make sure that these things these commitments are fulfilled, and again, recognizing that various parties might have different approaches to how to do that, but these are the issues that I think people are demanding some action on and demanding a clear path forward. So similarly, what is your party's plan to achieve equitable socioeconomic outcomes for individuals and communities facing systemic oppression? How will your party ensure that people disproportionately impacted by poverty, climate change, and other public health crises are included meaningfully in the design, implementation, and evaluation of policy decisions? So again, what are the processes that this party is going to use to get us there? Because again, any policy is only going to be as good as the processes that brought it about and that are going to implement it and ensure that there's meaningful accountability following up on it. Same thing with any piece of legislation, right? If there's going to be no accountability, then it has no teeth. So we want to know, again, what is each party's plan to close this gap in terms of the outcomes? And what changes will you make to Canada's tax policies to increase eligibility and uptake for benefits, to distribute wealth more equitably? So we, again, in terms of, in the same vein of a policy is only as good as its implementation or the processes that get us there. What are we going to do for folks who have barriers to filing their taxes, who aren't getting, it's great to have benefits out there, but if they can't access them, it's not helping. What about folks that are not using banks? What about folks who can't access the Canada Child Benefit, which is one of the key planks of our poverty reduction strategy, if that benefit is tied to their immigration status? So again, all these different pieces where we just need to keep pushing so that we get to that underlying reform and moving past surface levels on things. And in terms of a more equitable distribution of wealth, again, there may be different approaches to how we do that, but we should all agree that should be the end goal that we want to work towards. Deirdre, if you can move to the next slide. Thanks. The other sort of grouping that I've used to kind of collect a number of the thoughts in our election bulletin and the suggested questions that we have for candidates is around this idea of building a more livable world for all, and thinking about the interconnections and interrelations of our physical environment, the climate, and then those of us who live here on these lands, but also around the world. So we would like to know what each party's plan is to transition this country to a green economy that benefits all people, including those marginalized by our current systems. So again, not just sticking with sort of the business as usual in terms of transitioning to a green economy that still benefits the same people who benefit in this current economy, but how do we build an ever more equitable and encompassing and supportive economy that works for people rather than the other way around, of people just working to make the economy go. And again, I think the pandemic has been a real moment that has cracked open maybe some of our deeply held notions about our economy and how it works and how well it's working or not. And it's opened up some space for some more creative thinking about what some alternatives could be for an economic model. So thinking of something like a guaranteed basic income, for example, that can fluctuate with the boom and busts of a society's economic system, or different industries and whether they wax or wane. So again, thinking a little bit beyond what we've been told is just like, well, this is how it has to be, or moving past any kind of idea of trickle down economics, which I think we have been pretty clearly shown just doesn't work that way. So again, thinking about our climate and our economy not being at odds with one another, but that we can build a much more sustainable and resilient economy if we factor in sustainability and take care of our natural environment and all our relations as well. So related to that, another question we would suggest that folks ask is, what will they do to honor Indigenous people's right to free, prior, and informed consent on an ongoing basis, as well as existing treaty rights? So I think many of us who are settlers in this country have been learning a lot late, but albeit, learning a lot more in this present moment as we've been locating the bodies of children at former residential school sites and former hospital sites. That I think, it has spurred a lot of people to dig into this history a little bit more, but also not just the history of it, but the contemporary expressions of this colonial state and rule. And so learning, I think we're all getting used to these land acknowledgements at the beginning of webinars. And so maybe now more of us are familiar with the treaties that apply, or, in my situation, there is no treaty here because this land is unceded and unsurrendered. So learning a little bit more about what are the treaty rights. And I think, I only speaking for myself here, but I think growing up, I had this impression that, treaty rights weren't really the same as other law, which is false. And or the sense that, okay, there are these treaty rights, but what people are asking for now is above and beyond that. And that is also false, that the treaty rights just have not been honored. We haven't even honored our own agreements that we made with Indigenous peoples. And so again, we want to know, how is that going to change? Because we know that the repercussions of that would be huge across so many different policy areas. And so lastly, in this category then, how will you support climate change adaptation and mitigation measures in the global south, as well as honoring the rights of climate migrants and refugees? So as Canadians, we have to recognize that we put out far more than our fair share of emissions, which makes lands unlivable in other places around the world. And then at the same time, we close our doors to climate migrants, or we have immigration laws and policies that make it difficult for people to seek asylum, or to have any real chance of socioeconomic success or social inclusion, even if they do come here and successfully file a claim. So we have to make sure that there's consistency between our climate ambition and then the responsibility that we're taking for the impact of our choices globally, and making sure that we're honoring the rights of refugees, doing our part to prevent the need for them to leave in the first place, in the case of climate migrants, but also for those who do need a safe place to go. We should be ensuring that that we are sharing this land, particularly for those of us who are settlers, who are our guests here ourselves. And so those are kind of the big framing questions, and I know they're all pretty high level, and I didn't get too much into specific recommendations, but I know our other panelists are going to dig into some specific ideas on some of those themes. So I'm excited for those of you who have joined us tonight. I do have hope that there is this shared resolve to build a just future. And I just welcome you to check out our work at cpj.ca. Feel free to contact me if you have questions or if you'd like slides or a copy of the election bulletin. And thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That brilliant presentation in terms of really grounding us in such important essential issues. And on top of that, I want you to know that the link already went in there in the chat room for the report. So I want you to, I want you to know that you can already, people are already looking at it and loving it, I'm sure.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, so Natalie will be back and be part of our discussion after all the speakers. So thanks so much, Natalie, and I'll turn it over to Ted.
Well, at this point, I was going to ask Natalie a question or two. Just
Hi.
Yeah. But yeah, wonderful.
Why not?
What's that?
I said, why not? You're the MC. You can do whatever you want.
Just one or two questions. No, I think that as Natalie says, there's lots of information in the bulletin, and she's just skimmed the surface. I think, again, pandemics really shone that light on issues that a lot of us have been working on for many years, and just sort of again raised that the level of what is happening in our communities. I think that in a way that we haven't really been able to fully understand or see that impact. One of the things, one or two quick questions I'm going to ask. One, being a data person myself, I heard you talk about disaggregated data, and so I know what that means. Maybe enlighten people. What is disaggregated data? Why is it even important to be talking about in the light of, as we're engaging with our federal parties and our our federal government to come out a week from now? Why is this an important piece in this dialogue?
Sure, thanks for that. Yeah, so by disaggregated data, we mean, if for example, you're looking at something like core housing need, the percentage of people in Canada that are living in core housing need, you'll get an estimate from the most recent estimate, for example, is 11.6%. Disaggregated data means that you're breaking that larger set into different categories based on different criteria. So then you can say, okay, well, what if I want to know, okay, of those people, for example, how many of the people experiencing core housing need are Indigenous? How many are women or non-binary or gender non-conforming? How many are single? How many are racialized? How many have precarious immigration status? So anytime that you're breaking down data by a particular criteria or characteristic, that's disaggregating the data. You're breaking it into smaller groups. And that gives us a much more nuanced picture of what's happening. So for example, even just, at the level of looking at, Canada at large versus provinces and territories, for example, that same core housing need statistic jumps to over 45% if you're looking at Nunavut versus 11.6% nationally. And, same with, food security. Nationally, we're looking at an estimate of 1 in 8 households struggling to put food on the table, which is, I'm sure, an underestimate. And this is all pre-pandemic. But you look at households led by a single mother, and it's 1 in 4. So the more we know about these different criteria, then the better sense we have of what's really going on. And again, I do call for disaggregated data, and it's important in terms of tracking progress and accountability and things like that. But I will just also mention that it's also really critical that when we're talking about collecting data and how it's used, that again that there's accountability to the communities in terms of how that data is being collected, what's being done with it. Does the community benefit from that data being collected? So for example, the federal government has all kinds of data on First Nations people because of various, paperwork that has to be filled out. But what happens with it? And, it's not going into our official poverty count. Our official poverty line doesn't even include the territories or people living on reserves. So data matters because how we measure things, how we define them, and how we measure them, is going to impact what our results are and who is seeing those results. So one of our asks, for example, for sneak peek of our Chew on This campaign coming up this year is that we're going to be asking for specific targets and timelines set for equity seeking groups, because our current target for reducing poverty in Canada is to reduce it by 50% from 2015 levels by 2030. But, who's going to be in that 50%? Is it the folks that are just kind of hovering around that poverty line, or is it folks that are in, deep poverty who are facing intersecting forms of systemic oppression?
Great, thank you, appreciate that. One last quick question, and then I'm going to pass it over to Deirdre to introduce our next speaker. So you've talked on a range of topics and goals for a just Canada, and again, talking about those processes that need to be in place. So to give maybe a glimmer of hope, maybe if that's the right word, what are some examples you've seen where government and civil society community has worked together in new different ways to realize some of the kinds of goals that you're talking about? Do you have any that, just to give us that glimmer of hope that yes, this can happen?
Yeah, well, I always think that the climate marches that put climate change on the agenda for the last federal election is a really fantastic example of civil society really pushing an issue forward. And so I think that that's a great example of how that kind of public engagement, that civic engagement, has pushed federal policy. And I think too that with the national housing strategy, for example, the fact that there was a strong push to have housing recognized as a human right. And so there are some mechanisms then that open up for us in terms of making sure that there's ongoing accountability in terms of addressing the systemic nature of our housing crisis. That's another encouraging one. There's still work to be done to make sure that we get a housing advocate, and I don't want to steal Alex's material here, but so I think the fact that we have a poverty reduction strategy, again, that was something we were calling for over a decade, just as our campaign. But again, this work, and whether you're talking about reducing poverty or climate change, or whether you're looking more broadly at racial reconciliation or reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, like, folks have been doing this work from Indigenous and Black communities, for example, or disabled activists have been pushing these issues for decades, right? Like, this is long work, but I feel like we're at kind of a breakthrough moment, without sounding too, overly naive or optimistic. But I think we are at a breaking point where people are, as I mentioned, kind of open to what might have otherwise been seen as kind of more radical ideas, or rethinking or challenging the status quo. So the fact that we're talking about white supremacy and colonialism in Canada is a positive sign to me that we are moving forward on some of these things, at least with a common language. There's much work to be done for sure, but I think we are better equipped now, I think, to push through some of the platitudes and demand real change.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, Deirdre, I'll pass it over to you to introduce our next presenter.
Great, thanks so much. That was really wonderful. I'm really happy to be able to introduce Linda Lukassick. The around Hamilton, but beyond, Linda is just well known for really for founding and leading Environment Hamilton for a couple of decades, I think. And so I am happy to bring her forward tonight and have her talk to us about really, again, what I keep hearing and what so many of us know is really another one of these foundational, crucial issues that must, should have been addressed, must be addressed. What can we do? Linda, please tell us.
Thanks, Deirdre, and hi, everyone. It's great to have an opportunity to talk tonight, and I really appreciate the way Natalie has framed this and some of the questions that she's put out there, because I think they're really relevant to all the issues you're going to hear us talk about tonight. So I'm going to talk to you about the climate emergency, the climate crisis, but I want to frame it as an opportunity. And I think we all need to be, that may sound strange, but I think we do really need to be looking at it that way as we're having more and more serious conversations about creating and building a just society moving forward. You're not going to be shocked to hear me say to you that at Environment Hamilton, we really do believe that we are in a climate emergency. We believe it's dire. And we believe that I've started to call it the do or die decade. So this next 10 years is critical for us. If we don't see decisive action, we are going to be unable to avert climate catastrophe. And for anyone who follows the news on this, you would have seen in the media, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report within the last couple of weeks. And this entity is an interesting one. It's a whole lot of scientists from around the world, and ultimately what they release, it's different countries having to come to consensus on the positions that they'll take. So they often tend to kind of hold back a bit. And the messaging this time is urgent. And I just want to read part of what's in there to you, because I think it really helps to justify why I'm saying what I'm saying. And what they're telling us is that global warming of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades, and particularly in this one. So do or die. In other words, we can no longer stop some of what's already happened in the way of climate impact, and we're seeing that all around us. But with extreme reductions, we can avoid the catastrophic. So to me, that's a pretty good reason for us to get our stuff together here and figure out where we need to go. And I'll say to people, just think about the weather around you. I mean, sitting in Hamilton, and I know those of you in Halton have probably experienced the same thing. Even this week, the major booming and flashing and torrential rainfall almost every night of the week. There's one example of the kind of change that we're seeing. In parts of the world, it's far more dire with wildfires and heat domes and extreme flooding. So we need to pay attention. And we know in this part of the world where we all sit, the predictions show us that we're going to see more of these kinds of challenges. So you may be wondering, okay, then, how do we need to be looking at this when we're thinking about the federal election and our various candidates? I want to talk to you about a fellow named Seth Klein, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard the name. His sister is Naomi Klein. Seth recently wrote a very interesting book, and I want to talk a little bit about that because it's so relevant to this issue of climate and government. It's called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And so he uses, he looks at the Second World War and what we managed to do in Canada to respond to Nazi Germany, to Hitler. It may seem like a strange sort of analogy to use, but he looks at how we were so capable of mobilizing and achieving incredible change in very short amounts of time to tackle that crisis, to help other parts of the world with tackling that crisis. So think about that within the context of the climate emergency. And I think it's urgent that we do that. Again, I want to read a quote from his book because Klein really, I think, very effectively captures what I know makes me feel frustrated when I think about politicians in the climate emergency. And he says, we elect governments that promise climate action, they deliver underwhelming and contradictory policies, and then get replaced by right-wing governments that undo what little progress we've seen. This has been the Canadian story of the last 3 decades. What is clear from this record is that politics as usual won't cut it, and that status quo as a recipe for disaster. The incrementalism of the last 30 years will see us firm. And, if I was up in this session saying this to you 10 years ago, you'd probably think I was some crazy radical. But when you think about within the context of here and now, this is an issue, this is a problem. And so certainly when I've looked at the platforms of all of the parties when it comes to climate, I'm going to be very honest with you in saying that there still is that incrementalism. There still aren't those solid commitments to stop subsidizing fossil fuel operations, to commit to doing what needs to be done to leave it in the ground, to commit to the profound change that we need to see in our society, that transformational transition to what would be the better new normal that I think all of us have all been fighting in different ways to see happen. This time I'm going to say to you, this is an existential crisis. And so the push in that direction is a push that we can, collectively, and honestly, I'm going to say to you, I'm not convinced any of the parties are where they need to be in terms of the drastic change that we need to see the climate emergency addressed. But I think, again, that's where the civil society piece becomes so important, because I'm pretty confident that we've got the understanding and know-how out there to push in the right direction. And so certainly, when I talk about this crisis and I say to people, I'm frustrated with all of the political parties, I can walk through platforms, and you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear the order that they're placed in terms of the level of ambition in responding to climate. I'm still going to tell you that none of them are good enough. Too many approaches that are dependent on market-based solutions, too much of this incrementalism when we are in a dire crisis and we need profound change to be happening now. But in our work that we do in Environment Hamilton, we spend a lot of time more and more talking to people about building climate resilience, climate resilient communities that are inclusive, because all of those solutions that we're pushing for, better housing with a smaller carbon footprint, greening up the city, doing all of the things that we know we need to do, firm urban boundaries, protecting farmland, getting creative with intensification within urban areas. All of those things help us with, providing better housing for people who need it, for providing a much broader spectrum of housing choices, particularly on the affordability spectrum. At every level, when we start to think about the profound change that needs to happen to tackle the climate crisis, it seems like a no-brainer in terms of doing the right things on that front, helping to bring us what we need where all of these other issues are concerned. So I want to paint a positive picture moving forward, but I am going to say to you, ask your candidates tough questions about the climate emergency and how they're responding. And I'm going to say to you, I am feeling cynical about where they've landed right now. I don't think any of them have been bold enough, but I know the public there are lots of people in the public realm who are in the vanguard, whose heads are there and who are ready for that really ambitious change. So I think it's going to take a lot of us collectively pushing, but please be sure to hold. I shouldn't use sayings like hold their feet to the fire, but the fires sure are burning everywhere. So we need to push. So I'm going to stop there, but certainly be happy to chat more about climate crisis, but probably even more importantly, how it relates to building a better world. Thank you.
Thank you. You're pretty brief for such a big topic. It's not what I expected. But I, certainly what you're saying there in terms of any of the parties, that's the tough questions have to be asked because they're just nowhere near what really needs to happen. And I have another hat I'm just going to briefly bring into this, Linda. I work for the Anglican diocese, and so churches are trying to figure out, and other faith communities too, I know, but lots of in this post-pandemic, trying to figure out, about the use of those spaces, the greening of those spaces, like turning them into something that could be just far more useful in worship, but there's so much more that could happen in terms of hubs that are needed when the power goes out in neighborhoods and that kind of thing. Anyway, I think those are some of the creative things that are happening around Hamilton. There must be other stuff too. Like, I wonder if you could talk about something else in some other realms that are a bit more specific about some of the things that are actually happening here in Hamilton to address some of what you're saying just for a minute.
Absolutely, Deirdre. And you've used a great example, just the physical spaces that faith communities hold. And I think the interest in wanting to connect to community, we've done work in downtown Hamilton with building climate resilience hubs and using places of worship as sort of physical anchor locations and bringing people together in those spaces and talking about, in extreme weather circumstances, are those places that could step up and provide additional supports? Could those physical locations become places where people come together and get the instructions that they need to stay safe when we're dealing with, whether it's extreme winter storms or extreme rain and potential flooding? So there are lots of exciting possibilities through faith communities. That's one example. And that's sort of on the more acute end of the spectrum in terms of extreme impacts. But we're talking more and more about all of the things that happen in between. So how do you start to bring community together and have really meaningful conversations about building neighborhood networks of caring so that people are watching out for each other on a day-to-day? And it could be a stretch of extreme heat in the summertime, and is everyone checking on the neighbor down the street who's on her own and she's elderly, and there's a benefit to checking in and making sure she's okay. Longer term in Hamilton, we're seeing really amazing things happen, and this is an example where higher levels of government stepping up and providing supports so that we can transition more quickly would be hugely beneficial. Housing providers like Indwell and City Housing Hamilton, the city's social housing system, shifting in the direction of using passive house standard to build accommodation for people in need in the community. And there's a fantastic example where that not only pays attention to the climate emergency, right, because those buildings can be heated and cooled with little to no energy, but also creating spaces where vulnerable community members are going to be comfortable in extreme heat and extreme cold. That's the sort of thing that we need to see happening more and more. And so we do have great inspirational examples here that need to be replicated across the city. And I'd argue, for all of us, so that we hit a point where we've transitioned our building stock to a form that's going to be better for the climate and better for all of us. And as I'm describing this, what I'm going to say next. I mean, those buildings that exist in communities right across the country that need that retrofitting, fantastic opportunity for green job creation. So when we all talk about that idea of good green jobs for people and transitioning people out of problem industries, these are the kind of creative conversations that we need to be having, and in a very comprehensive, quickly scaled up way. That's the kind of change that we need to be hearing our federal leaders talking about. And we're hearing about it in bits and pieces here and there, but we can't mess around anymore, right? We need to be ready. And I'll say, do or die decade. This is, we've procrastinated for too long, and now we've really got to get moving. And I see plenty of opportunity that federal leaders could have grabbed onto in a big, bold way, and unfortunately, on these kinds of examples that are really needed in communities, we just haven't heard enough.
Right. Great. Well, thanks. There'll be opportunity for more questions later. I appreciate that.
Right.
I want to say that we have in the chat room put a link to a bio of Linda that comes from the Environment Hamilton website. I would urge you to click on that, but also then go looking around for these opportunities that Linda's mentioning around if you're in Hamilton around the building neighborhood piece, but also I'm sure I know there's lots of resources there. So please avail yourself of those. I also put in there bio from Natalie as well, just a little bit more information about Natalie. And I think I had the wrong date when I said it earlier for Chew on This. It is the 17th, the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty is proclaimed by the UN. So we'll be looking at that later. And just before Ted introduces our next speaker, I mentioned another hat I wear without even mentioning the most important hat around here tonight in terms of Ted at the Community Development Halton and me at the Social Planning Research Council. We are both gratefully funded by the United Way of Halton Hamilton, and we have a wonderful partnership that works really well with them, and it's because of them that we're able to put on these sorts of things, and very grateful for that. So thank you to the United Way. And so Ted, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, it's my privilege now to introduce our next speaker on a topic that I mentioned, childcare, which is, I think, definitely one of those top of mind for many across this country and in this federal election. And so Judith Bishop is joining us to talk about childcare. And she's an advocate for children and youth. She was a trustee for the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board for 26 years, chair for 5 years, worked through collaboratives such as Halton Best Start Network, Hamilton Healthy Babies Coalition, and United Way of Hamilton Burlington Youth Strategy. And Judith is also a founding member of the Hamilton School-Based Health Network and Umbrella Family and Child Centers, where she currently sits as chair of the board. And Judith works for Equity, most recently as an equity champion for the Social Planning Network of Ontario, the Knowledge Network Student Working Group, and the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, and has been advocating for early learning and care since she ran a childcare center in Zimbabwe, where in the distant past, she worked as a development worker. Lots of awards that Judith has received from all of her tireless work in community. I think I'm going to leave it at that and turn this over to Judith so that she can share her thoughts around childcare, especially as we engage our federal candidates and the federal platforms. So over to you, Judith.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me, because we're at a really important point for national childcare program. The COVID-19 has shown how important childcare is to families. It was devastating when childcare was closed. Women couldn't work, and only they rustled around to provide us some emergency childcare. But this has shown the essential nature of childcare in our society. But what I want to talk about is that we need a national, quality, affordable, accessible, and inclusive childcare program. It can't just be any old kind of program. The quality part, for example, it's quality programs that make long-lasting impacts on children. The famous study that was done in Michigan, Ypsilanti, of the high scope Perry preschool program, which followed, had a control group of kids who were not offered quality programming, early childhood programming, and another group who were, and followed these two groups for 40 years, found that these kids who had the quality programming had more graduations from school, had more work experience, had better experiences in school. They weren't expelled as often. They didn't need special education, and continued to be in employment and to be more successful by the age of 40. More of them graduated from community colleges, for example. So, and quality programming depends on proper staffing. And that is another area where we have done so poorly. Just like in long-term care, we have a workforce which is underestimated, unappreciated, with terrible working conditions, and not paid at all well, even though they have most of them have a 2-year community college diploma. So what else, if we're going to have a quality program, how else do things stand? How accessible is childcare? Well, in Hamilton, there are only enough places for every 3 children out of 10. That is licensed quality childcare. Childcare is not affordable, Some people talk about then having childcare is like paying for childcare is like paying for a second mortgage. And the OECD has noted that in Canada, 22% of family income is spent on childcare, while only 15% of family income is spent on childcare in OECD countries. And there is, as I've already indicated, a shortage of qualified staff. Now, for once, there's been a response at this election, and all political parties have put forward something about childcare. The Conservatives have come up with a child tax credit, and the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens are talking about a universal childcare system. So what would the Conservative Party child tax credit provide? Well, the first thing is to know that the $6,000 that they're offering would not be available to most parents. Most parents will not be able to access this $6,000 credit. In fact, the Canadian Civic Policy Alternatives, the CPCPA, have indicated that they believe that only about 6,600 people in the whole of Canada will actually receive this full credit, this full 6,000 credit. While the NDP and the Liberals are promising a $10 a day program in 2025, which would reduce infants' childcare, for example, by $11,236 a year, a tangible program. Most low-income parents, those earning under 22,000 in Canada, would get the most out of the Conservative childcare program, but the most that they would receive on a yearly basis would be $1,500. And of course, you have to apply for this program, for the Conservative program, and you have to fill in taxes, and you have to fill in paperwork for it. And we've already seen that a child tax credit program under the Ford government, which is what we've had for the last couple of years, hasn't led to improved access or lowered cost for childcare in our province. And so it also hasn't, the Conservative child tax program is not going to look at diversity. The Liberal and NDP are looking at an Indigenous program. They're not looking at increasing spaces, while the NDP and Liberal programs would also be looking at capital monies to not-for-profits and public funding agencies to provide childcare. And they've not considered a quality workforce, and a quality workforce leads to quality programming. And there are things about that in both the Liberal and NDP programs. So the Conservative program doesn't give a lot to families, while the Liberal and NDP would provide accessible, affordable programs, a capped program, $10 a day, and it would be a substantial step forward in this country. So I think we have to vote for quality childcare programs. We have to vote for a universal childcare system which is publicly funded, depends on not-for-profit and municipally run childcare, and provides for the needs of Indigenous children. And I think there are lots of questions that we need to be asking, like, with 8 of the provinces and territories to date agreeing to early learning childcare building, what is your party's plan or commitment to honouring and continuing this essential work? And with Canadian parents have long struggled to find affordable, high-quality childcare spaces to support parents and their economic security, how will you be expanding and enhancing childcare spaces? And the work of Canada's early learning childcare sector is essential Does your plan make an ongoing commitment to value and support the early childhood educator position? And although the Liberal and NDP plans have some really good things in them, as Linda was suggesting, it's not the end. We need to go on asking questions to make sure these are quality programs, that they will be supporting the early learning childcare workforce in a way that will lead to stability for them and a profession that will attract people into it. And so we need to go on supporting the need for quality childcare. But the NDP and the Liberal platforms are a really good starts. So I hope those are what people will support.
Thank you so much for that, Judith. Really, really important, and obviously can feel your passion on this topic. And you know, I was really struck when you said, when you talked about, you know, around the affordability piece and how that for many it is, you know, like a second mortgage. And I quickly glanced at some of the calculations I've been doing for this living wage update that I've been doing, and you know, in Halton, we're with this, you know, our reference family of 4 with a 7 and a 3-year-old, we're looking at about $21,000 childcare costs in a year before subsidies, which is about roughly around 23% of their cost of living in a given year. Well, that's pretty substantial when you're almost a quarter of your living expenses in a given year could be eaten up by childcare. And so definitely, I think this is a really critical issue that we need to be talking about. Thank you so much again for your presentation, for the questions that we need to be asking. Deirdre, over to you.
Do me a favor, Judith, hold your sign up again.
Yeah, that was
I'm going to
awesome.
get a little screenshot. Yeah, that's awesome. Great. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move to our next speaker, and then so that there'll be a little bit more time for some questions at the end. So thank you so much there. I'd like to take a second just to say that I'm going to put more information in the chat room about Alex, but I'd like to now introduce Alex. Alex Nelson is from VoteHousing.ca, a huge housing advocate, and especially around engaging with the people with lived experience of the realities of precarious and unhoused and underhoused and so on. And so that's what we're going to hear about now. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for such an important campaign. We're excited to hear about it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. And if my slides...
Want me to do that?
Perfect. Yes, thank you so much. So hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Alex. I use they, them pronouns. I'm joining today as a guest in traditional and unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen, Saanich, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples. And as Deirdre mentioned, I'm here representing the Vote Housing campaign and the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network. I am a person with lived experience of homelessness and going through the child welfare system. I bring that into the work that I do, and I hope to talk about a little bit about that today. So could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Vote Housing is the largest nonpartisan housing advocacy campaign in Canadian history, and our mission is to engage Canadians to pledge to vote housing this federal election and to ensure all political parties support making bold investments in affordable housing and in ending homelessness. So today I'm going to run you through our 6 Vote Housing campaign platform points, which you can find outlined at VoteHousing.ca. I'm wearing my little Vote Housing pin here. And also available on our website, we recently released a super handy and very informative analysis of how the political party platforms stack up against our vote housing policy points. And so I'm going to go through those points pretty quickly. I won't go through every single one, but all of those are available at our website, VoteHousing.ca, so you can read them more in depth and a little slower. So the first policy point is implement an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy containing both dedicated investments and an Indigenous-led governance structure. So there is no dedicated federal for Indigenous by Indigenous strategy to address housing needs of all Indigenous peoples in urban, rural, and northern communities. Indigenous peoples disproportionately experience homelessness. And now, as Natalie mentioned, this is directly linked to the ongoing colonization and systemic dislocation and dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands, languages, and cultures. So notably, all parties have explicitly committed to an Indigenous housing strategy in their platforms, with several parties dedicating investments to realizing this commitment. The lack of a by Indigenous for Indigenous housing strategy is really glaring, and it is incredibly significant that all parties not only recognize this, but also seek to address this gap through the leadership of Indigenous peoples. So we need to be looking for that leadership in policy platforms. So the next policy point, commit to the prevention and elimination of homelessness. An estimated 1.6 million Canadians have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives, and over 20% of Canadians know someone who has experienced homelessness, and 11% have a family member who has experienced it. Rural and remote communities are also struggling with significant rates of homelessness and housing need, but are not receiving adequate or equitable funding under the National Housing Strategy. A growing number of communities across North America are having success in reducing and ending homelessness. So it is possible. There are ways forward, and there are ways to address homelessness. Several parties have committed to ending chronic homelessness with several specific commitments and plans to end veteran homelessness. So I challenge voters to think about homelessness as a complex experience with intersecting causes and consequences, such as colonization, white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and saneism, to name a few. And as Judith mentioned, we can't end homelessness with just any policy framework or approach to housing. To end homelessness, elected leaders have to seriously address those systemic factors. We need to elect leaders who can meaningfully speak the language of justice, equity, and decolonization. That's super, super important. So 3, we need to invest in the construction and operation of a minimum of 50,000 units of supportive housing over a decade. While the vast majority using emergency shelter services experience homelessness only once and only temporarily, some have complex needs that require intensive supports to end their homelessness. There is a lack of affordable, accessible housing. Households that require accessibility adaptations are more likely to experience affordability challenges, and housing investments should prioritize people experiencing or at greatest risk of homelessness. So all parties have housing platforms, which really signals the re-entrenched federal leadership on housing. And all parties have made some form of housing promises, which is really great. I've been glad to see parties using the language of housing as a crisis in Canada, which is the only word that captures the scope and the depth of these issues. Notably, 8 in 10 Canadians in a recent Nanos poll support building more affordable housing as part of pandemic recovery. Candidates need to be listening to this call from the overwhelming majority of voters. We want this and we need this. So policy point number 4, build and acquire a minimum of 300,000 units of deeply affordable, non-market, co-op, and nonprofit housing over a decade. There are not enough affordable, accessible housing options for Canadians, contributing to growing economic and social inequities. The lack of affordable housing is one of the largest contributors to homelessness, kind of point blank, that's it. In Canada, there is a shortage of accessible, affordable housing, which is why a portion of these new units must be specifically designed to be fully accessible. And over 1.7 million Canadian households cannot access a home that they can afford that does not need major repairs and/or is not overcrowded. This is experienced disproportionately by people with disabilities, women, children, seniors, Indigenous peoples, and racialized communities. For housing to be affordable, the predominant thinking is that it should represent 30% or less of total household income. Housing in some parts of Canada can cost as much as 80 or 90% of household income, which means it is nowhere near this common benchmark of affordability. Echoing Natalie again, advocates have been calling for not just a critical redefinition of affordability to adequately address the lived reality of those experiencing affordability concerns, but also to support a shift to rent that is geared to household income. We need to be pushing for parties to explain exactly what metrics they're using to define and assess affordability. This is really important because the word gets thrown around a lot, but we need to know exactly what parties mean when they use the term. So policy point number 5, commit to the progressive realization of the right to housing, including measures to curtail the impact of the financialization of rental housing markets, addressing the unique needs of equity-seeking communities in the National Housing Strategy, and ensuring people with lived expertise of housing need and homelessness are engaged in all levels of policy development and implementation. So we know that homelessness is the result of systemic denials of access to justice and fundamental human rights. And housing is essential to the inherent dignity and well-being of a person and to building sustainable and inclusive communities. The disparity between the right to free and equal existence and the current homelessness crisis has become more apparent than ever. The financialization of rental housing in Canada is taking affordable housing out of the market faster than it can be replaced, compounding Canada's housing crisis. And policies and actions must be sensitive to the historical and ongoing impacts of stigma, prejudice, and oppression on individuals and communities. Deliberate action must be undertaken to address the ways that intersecting systems and structures compound experiences of homelessness. The expansion of market rate or market-based housing and the retrenchment of non-market, deeply affordable rent geared to income housing is driving the financialization of housing. This means that housing, and then the way we conceptualize and build policy around housing, is currently rooted in the belief that housing is a commodity to be bought and sold. This is in direct opposition to a rights-based housing strategy, which is ostensibly what we have in Canada through our national housing strategy. And when people talk about the term right to housing, what they're referring to is an alternate conceptualization of what housing actually is and how policy should support it. On a really narrow scale, the right to housing is the obligation of a state to provide housing that is safe, affordable, accessible, and culturally appropriate. But there are a lot of things that make housing unaffordable, inaccessible, and culturally inappropriate. And these are the things that prevent people from accessing housing in the first place. Because of this, and because the barriers are distinct for different communities and individuals, the right to housing can never just refer to habitation or the provision of a physical structure to live in. The right to housing, for this reason, also expands to addressing broader historical, ongoing, and deeply fundamentally interconnected issues of injustice and inequality. So policy point number 6, expand rental assistance for low-income households to reduce core housing need and to prevent a new wave of homelessness resulting from the pandemic. So 530,000 renter households in Canada pay over 50% of their income on rent. That's huge. That's huge. That's, as I said, common benchmarks say that affordable housing is 30% or less. So that many households to pay 50% of their income in rent is unacceptable. And economic pressures are growing, in part from the financialization of rental housing markets, rapid inflation of the cost of housing, and increasing income inequality. Rental assistance can either be direct financial supports to households living in market or non-market housing, or direct financial support to non-market housing providers in order to offset the cost of rent for low-income households. So we see in the recently released party platforms a lot of focus on mortgages and a lot of policies that target middle or upper class Canadians. And as other experts on housing have indicated, fueling demand for housing, including providing incentives and credits for those in a position to purchase housing, will actually serve to continue to drive up the cost of housing. I really loved when Linda referred to policy that is underwhelming and contradictory. We see this contradiction in housing, where parties say they're committed to affordability, when in reality, promoting policies that will directly exacerbate housing unaffordability. and as other experts have warned, will result in an even more stratified housing system. When parties talk about housing and the housing crises facing Canadians, it's really important to think critically about who their policies will benefit. If those policies will only stand to benefit some, especially those with significant financial and social resources, those policies will not end homelessness and will not address the depth of core housing need we see today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for reminding me about my button. So I added that. I see Kim Martin, the executive director of the SPRC, has added hers as well. And I want to do a little shout out that I still have about 5 or 6 of these kits at my home in downtown Halton. Kim's got her signed too. They're cute as a button. They don't overtake your garden, that's for sure. But they come with a little stick and everything. So if you live in downtown Halton, or you can get around or whatever, I have 5 of these. You should have them because I've already ordered them and paid for them. So let's figure out a way to do that. But it's an amazing campaign. And Alex, yeah, your presentation is amazing. We've all had an opportunity to ask questions, Ted and I. So just in our last 5 minutes, I just want to open it up and see if there's anybody that is wanting to ask any one of our speakers a question. If you want to wave or unmute yourself and hail me, you're welcome to do so. You must like our own questions so much that you're okay with us just carrying on. I was wanting to ask Alex, if it's okay, a bit about, you know, the fact that this campaign and your work in it, especially also as someone with lived experience, you know, this one of the toughest things during the pandemic in some of the work I do around women's homelessness and single women experiencing homelessness, women and gender diverse people and trans people and non-binary people in Hamilton. We have an advisory table made up of people with lived experience, which we have not been able to bring together in an effective way. And, you know, so anyway, you're inspiring me to think that obviously this campaign has been able to do it. Do you have any tips about how, or, you know, how is what I want to know, but just why is it so important, do you think, to have this voice in this conversation?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's really amazing news that you have this group of people who are motivated and dedicated and ready to share their lived experiences, because I think it is so fundamental to ending homelessness. And so I guess I'll share a little bit about the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network, which is how I come to the Vote Housing campaign. So CLELIN is a network of people with lived experience of homelessness, and we are really committed to advancing the role of lived experience in realizing the right to housing and ending and preventing homelessness in Canada. And so in general, I see the act of claiming experiences of homelessness as fundamentally political. The act of refusing to be silenced and refusing to be ashamed. And so it's really important that you bring people with lived experience and their voices, their skills, their talents, their wisdom on board in order to hold government to account for ending homelessness. And so we've really been involved in Vote Housing as equal partners at the table. And that's provided us with an incredible opportunity to amplify the voices, skills, and profound knowledge of this community. And so there are kind of two things that are really important in lived experience advocacy. One is to recognize the full person who comes to a space of advocacy. So all of the skills that they bring and how best to mobilize or amplify the skills that they already come to the table with. But also to provide opportunities for people to gain new skills, for example, in speaking to the media or in speaking to politicians, things that people might not come to the table with already. It's just a way of matching people with opportunities. And I mentioned throughout my presentation, 1.6 million Canadians have experienced homelessness in their lives. but 36% of Canadians have experienced homelessness or know someone who has. And I really think that's something that can't be ignored, because we, as people with lived experience of homelessness, are the voting public. And so actually, again, to echo Natalie, the process of how policy programming and planning takes place is super vital. So unfortunately, in our recent analysis of the political party platforms, we didn't see an explicit commitment to that deep, meaningful engagement of people with lived experience of homelessness as a core pillar of implementing housing planning policy and programs. And that representation and specifically leadership of those most impacted is a core element of realizing the right to housing. And it's not just the Lived Experience Leadership Network who's arguing this. Actually, Leilani Farha, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, also has called and advocated for lived experience leadership. And lived experience leadership is actually burgeoning across the homelessness and housing sector. It is, in my opinion, an ethical necessity, but it's also a key pillar in addressing homelessness and housing need. And for me to recognize a party as actually understanding what it takes to further housing rights in Canada, I would need to see that explicit commitment to lived experience engagement. Obviously, there are lots of different ways that people engage people with lived experience of homelessness, but looking to people who are already doing that work and doing it well is a really good place to start. So, the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network is a really great resource, and we're always happy to help people out or offer advice and insight into how to more ethically and respectfully build those spaces of trust and lived experience engagement. Thanks for asking the question. It's a great question.
Yeah, well, it's great information. I mean, I'll be looking up Clellan. You'll be hearing more from me, that's for sure. But it isn't just about me, but I did want to add that Tom has put a great comment in the chat that we have all these requests of the federal government. Absolutely. But it doesn't rest on one level of government, as we've often said. And here in our own municipality in Hamilton, we certainly have a lot to think about, and Halton will have their own issues, and then we have the provincial in between. So, but of course, this was our focus today, was that we're all, I hope, either voted or voting on Monday. And so this has certainly been an informative conversation, not just for our decisions on Monday, but for the forward thinking for the years to come. Ted, like this is, did you not gain just so much out of this tonight?
Oh yeah, no, I think there's a lot that we've learned, a lot of food for thought, and of course, it doesn't end with us, voting on Monday, but it's how do we continue to hold our federal government to account and make sure that we move forward on these important issues that we've talked about tonight. I think that's really critical, and make sure that again how they engage all of us as citizens in these solutions to these really critical issues that are facing our communities.
Great. Well, listen, we are right on just a minute or two after 8 o'clock, and I think this has been one of the smartest 90 minutes I've spent, or I feel smarter anyway after these 90 minutes, and I know that people have appreciated it. I want to thank you so much. I know that this will be a conversation that will be watched even in the future. Each one of you has added so much to us, and we thank you, and we look forward to seeing you after the election so we can get on all of these things that you've been talking about. And I ask you to watch for SPRC and Community Development Halton. We'll be holding a third one of these webinars in about 3 months. And again, we expect it to be as informative as this. And thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great night, everyone. And let's vote for a just Canada.